when most people hear the acronym UFO, it's almost immediately associated with a bunch of conspiracy nutjobs and aliens in flying saucers. However, it wasn't always like this, and UFOs posed a very real problem, not just for the public, but for world governments themselves. Now, over the past few years, the US government especially has definitely changed their tune on the topic of UFOs, and it's gone from being a very real threat to nothing more than a conspiracy joke. Just a disclaimer, in this video we'll try to avoid any cases from thousands of years ago because there are quite a few, but as you know, it's almost impossible to verify anything. They could have just been misidentified natural phenomena, and there's just no way to tell what they saw back then. You should lose any preconceived notions of what UFOs are, and you need to realize that there's no evidence that they're from space or that there's such a thing as aliens anywhere near us. Chances are that if there is actually alien life somewhere out there, they're nowhere near us and they're not even aware of Earth's existence. So then, let's take a look behind the curtain of UFO conspiracies and myths and try to narrow down just the facts. Unidentified flying objects are usually nothing more than weird cloud formations in the sky, misidentified aircraft, and, wait for it, balloons. Some modern day cases of UFOs are usually just publicity stunts and hoaxes, but once we filter out all the easily explained cases, what are we left with? Well, let's look at some of the most baffling UFO cases in past and recent history. This is how the story goes. In the morning of April 14th, 1561, at daybreak, between 4 and 5 am, a dreadful apparition occurred on the sun, and then this was seen in Nuremberg, the city, before the gates, and in the country by many men and women. At first there appeared in the middle of the sun two blood-red semicircular arcs, just like the moon in its last quarter, and in the sun, above and below and on both sides, the colour was blood, and there stood a round ball of partly dull, partly black ferrous colour. Likewise there stood on both sides, and as the torus about the sun, such blood-red ones and other balls in large number, about 3 in a line and 4 in a square. Also come alone, in between these globes were visible a few blood-red crosses, between which there were blood-red strips, becoming thicker to the rear, and in the front malleable like the rods of reed grass, which were intermingled, and within the small and big rods there were 3, also 4 more globes. These all started to fight amongst themselves, so that the globes, which were first in the sun, flew out to the ones standing on both sides. Thereafter, the globes standing outside the sun in the small and large rods flew into the sun. Besides, the globes flew back and forth amongst themselves and fought vehemently with each other for over an hour. Now, this is obviously not the most reliable of sources or eyewitness accounts, of course. This was from a time where Christianity and religiosity was the norm. The explanations range from a swarm of insects to just a made-up or exaggerated story. This is why cases from the far past won't be included after this one, and they are naturally shrouded in mystery since nobody is alive to recall the events firsthand. More modern cases, however, are much more puzzling and begin to beg the question of what these things actually are. One of the more interesting and mysterious aspects of UFO sightings is just how interested the US government was in them. Initially, UFOs were a threat and a curiosity. The US government quietly put together Project Sign in 1947 in order to understand this phenomena. However, not much later, the US government had reverted their stance and began a mass debunking campaign in which UFO cases were dismissed openly and made out to be nothing more than a crazy conspiracy theory. By 1953, the Air Force declared that UFO cases were nothing more than misidentification and hoaxes. However, they also admitted that 23% of the investigated cases were simply unexplainable. This is where Project Blue Book comes in. The Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt led this new investigation and began to silently investigate tens of thousands of cases, However, when Project Blue Book failed to answer a large number of UFO cases, and with many new UFO cases and unexplainable sightings coming in, it changed. The Robertson panel was formed just a year after Project Blue Book, and that panel made sure that UFOs became the subject of ridicule, and all other UFO investigators should be monitored by intelligence agencies. I wish this was all one crazy conspiracy theory, but unfortunately it is a documented historical fact. Why did the US Air Force change its tune so many times? Were they scared and confused by the cases? Did they attempt to prevent a mass panic? Or did they actually debunk the various UFO cases? One thing is for sure, they most definitely did not debunk a large handful of the cases being investigated. The number of unsolved cases ranged between 3,000 and 5,000. However, the conclusion was set in stone. UFOs were not deemed a national threat to security, and were therefore dismissed entirely. However, whilst the military publicly denounced UFOs, they silently continued receiving reports and sightings, investigating them, and who is to know what else they may have found or discovered. One thing is made clear by all this, and that is that some UFOs truly have unexplainable origins, and the fact that the government took this seriously should mean something. There is something in our skies, and we just can't explain what it is or where it comes from. Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was a claimed UFO incident that occurred on November 17, 1986, involving a Japanese Boeing 747 cargo aircraft. The aircraft was en route from Paris to Narita International Airport near Tokyo. On the Reykjavik to Anchorage section of the flight, at 5 over eastern Alaska, the crew first witnessed two unidentified objects to the left. These abruptly rose from below and closed in to escort their aircraft. Each had two rectangular arrays of what appeared to be glowing nozzles or thrusters, though their bodies remain obscured by darkness. When closest, the aircraft's cabin was lit up and the captain could feel their heat on his face. These two craft departed before a third, much larger disc-shaped object started trailing them. The crafts were described by Captain Terauchi at the time as having a disregard for inertia. He says, and I quote, "The thing was flying as if there were no such thing as gravity. It sped up, then it stopped, then it flew at our speed, in our direction, so that to us it appeared to be standing still. In the next instant it changed course. In other words, the craft had allegedly overcome gravity." After speaking to the press, Captain Terauchi was demoted to a desk job by his airline, and he eventually retired in Japan. But what makes this case special and distinguishes it from other similar cases is the fact that this sighting was one of the first to be confirmed on both radar and visually, and the fact that Captain Terauchi had no reason to lie only further concretes this very baffling sighting. The FAA's conclusion, however, stated that they did not have enough material to confirm that something was there, and although they were accepting the descriptions by the crew, they were unable to support what they saw. And just like that, the case remains unsolved. Alone in his patrol car, Sergeant Lonnie Zamora was chasing a speeding car due south of Socorro, New Mexico on April 24th, 1964 at about 6:45 p.m. when he heard a roar and saw a flame in the sky some distance away. Thinking a local dynamite shack might have exploded, Zamora broke off the chase and went to investigate. The weather at the time was clear and sunny, with just a few clouds scattered above the area. Zamora describes the noise as a roar, not a blast, as would be common with a jet engine. And as Zamora's car went over the hill that blocked the view of the craft, he noted that there was silence, and for the next 10 to 15 seconds he proceeded to drive towards the object, and it was then that he noticed the shiny object about 200 yards away. And at first he thought it must have been an overturned white car, and he spotted two people standing very close to it who were wearing white overalls and seemed to be surprised to see him. The object was described as being shiny like aluminium, with a slightly whitish colour, and it was shaped like the letter O. The object also was described as having a very strange insignia that is still unrecognisable to this day. Zamora only caught a brief sight of the two people in white coveralls beside the car, and he recalls nothing special about them, saying, "I don't recall noting any particular shape or possibly any hats or headgear. These persons appeared normal in shape, but possibly they were small adults or large kids." As Zamora got out of his car and radioed his dispatcher, he noticed that the two people were gone. It was then that he heard a very loud roar. Not exactly a blast, nothing like a jet. It was a roar that rose in frequency and loudness. Zamora dove for cover, thinking that the object was going to explode, but he kept an eye on the object, and as it rose, he observed a smokeless flame beneath the object, akin to a welding torch, bluish in colour, without making a single sound. And then the object proceeded to just fly away, completely silent, with that smokeless flame beneath it. It flew away at an altitude of around 20 feet above the ground. Zamora did contact a nearby officer called Nep Lopez, but it's unclear if he saw the object or not. Now, you may be thinking, hold on a second, couldn't this entire story be fake? Well, here's what makes this case a little bit special. You see, there were actually other witnesses that reported this exact object at the same time as Lonnie Zamora. One of the more notable witnesses was a family of 5 tourists from Colorado that reported the sighting to a service station operator. According to the service station operator, Grinder, the husband of the family told him, "Your aircraft sure do fly low around here," and that the object almost took the roof off of their car. The man also saw a police car chase after the object. But one of the most interesting pieces of evidence is the actual landing site itself. Investigators gathered plant samples for analysis, and they found that they had been unusually completely dried out. And there's also no evidence of radiation found, but 2 organic substances of unknown origin were discovered at the site. And apparently fused sand was also found at the landing site, where the sand had taken on a glassy appearance. And now there's all this combined with the fact that there was an area of localized footprints at the alleged landing site. Now there's almost no way for Zamora to have faked this, and even if it wasn't for all this evidence, Zamora's character wasn't ever even questioned. Even the Air Force had to admit that, and I quote, "There is no doubt that Lonnie Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. There's also no question about Zamora's reliability, as he is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in his area. He's puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we." But this is one of the most baffling UFO cases out there, and there aren't really any simple, straightforward explanations for it. However, I have a slight feeling that, judging by the sound of the object, it sounds like some sort of military test aircraft. Maybe something that NASA would have used to train astronauts to land on other planets. It definitely does resemble some sort of advanced lunar lander type craft, although the entire situation is very, very suspect. Now, the Air Force's final conclusion on this case said that the report was riddled with errors, and they claimed that there were no other witnesses despite the fact that there were several other witnesses, and they also claimed there were no disturbances in the soil, which is a complete lie. So yeah, once again, there's just no explanation for this. The USS Nimitz incident was another one of those encounters that was identified on both radar and visually, and it was first spotted by the commander of the Strike Fighter Squadron 41, which communicated that they saw a flying object. This UFO sighting is also backed by a lot of thermal footage of the UFOs. Now, here's what was reported by the pilots. Initially, the pilots noticed a round section of turbulent water around 50 to 100 meters in diameter before returning to the Nimitz carrier. They didn't see any source for the disturbance, and there was no unknown radar contact either. It just looked like an area of frothy waves and churning water around the size of a Boeing 737 aircraft. The colour at the centre was almost as if the waves were breaking over some sort of object submerged just beneath the surface. And now this is where things begin to get a bit more interesting. As the pilots looked back towards the area, they noticed an unusual object hovering with erratic movements at about 50 feet above the water. And the object was described as a large white tic-tac. No windshield, no portholes, no wings, no engines or exhaust plumes. The pilots tried to catch up to the UFO, but it accelerated away within seconds, which left the pilots pretty weirded out. At the same time, two other fighter pilots began their course to the Combat Air Patrol rendezvous point, and that's when they noticed that a radar target appeared at their rendezvous point before they did. And now the thing is, in order to get to that rendezvous point before these jets did, that object on their radar would have had to have travelled at a speed greater than 2400 miles an hour, or just under 4000 kilometers an hour. But the object didn't just get there before the jets. The object got there within seconds, which means that it would have to fly at 42,000 miles an hour, or just under 70,000 kilometers an hour. But by the time the F-18s arrived at their designated location, the object had disappeared. When the pilots were asked for their opinion, they speculated that what they saw was something not from Earth. But before you go around and associate all UFOs with aliens, there are quite a few logical, if not weak, explanations for this sighting. And these explanations range from birds to some sort of secret military aircraft, maybe even from another country. But either way, one thing is for sure, none of these explanations are conclusive. And I think the most likely explanation would probably be equipment failure or just something to do with their radar equipment. But this obviously doesn't explain the visual sightings, but then that's where all the bird theories could come in, I suppose. At 11:40 PM Saturday 1952, Edward Nugent, an air traffic controller at the Washington National Airport, had spotted 7 objects on his radar screen. The objects were located about 15 miles away southwest of the city, and there were no other known aircraft in the area at the time. Also, the objects were not following any sort of established flight path. Both Nugent and his superior, Harry Barnes, watched the radar screens with great interest, as they later said that they knew immediately that a very strange situation had existed, and that their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. And now this is where this case begins to get a bit more wild, as they had actually seen one of the objects from their radar screens in the sky, which looked like a bright hovering light that took off, zooming away at incredible speeds. And now at this point, other objects also appeared on the radar scope, and they moved above the White House and the United States Capitol building. And well, this is where the Air Force naturally gets involved, as Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base, and although they didn't see any objects on their radar screens yet, one of their airmen called the base to report a very strange sighting, which was, of course, one of the objects in the sky. And he also said that it looked like an orange ball of fire with a tail, and it took off at unbelievable speeds. And now that's quite a few reports from all very separate individuals around the same time. And on one of the runways of the National Airport, one of the pilots of a DC-4 was asking for permission to take off, which is where he spotted an object that he believed to be a meteor, and then he was told by the control tower that they were in fact spotting very strange objects on radar. Jets were scrambled and were sent out to intercept the objects, but when they arrived, all of the objects had seemingly vanished, almost as if they knew what was going on. And when the jets ran out of fuel and had to go back to base, the objects naturally returned. And everyone interviewed was sure that the objects on the radar screens were solid metal objects. and the Air Force's explanation attempts for this string of events is quite poor. One of the Air Force representatives, Sam Ford, declared that the visual sightings over Washington were just misidentified aerial phenomena, such as stars and meteors. It sounds a bit dodgy, but okay. But then he goes to state that the unknown radar targets were just temperature inversions and other atmospheric effects. But the massive problem with the temperature inversion theory was that weather experts have come out to say that this is complete nonsense. Weather inversions look absolutely nothing like that, and pilots monitoring the radar scopes would also ignore such atmospheric phenomena. No, the objects were precise, small points on the radar scope, which indicates that they were actual real-life objects. But of course, I don't really blame the Air Force here, as they were just trying to get the press off their backs. And another explanation for one of the sightings that the pilots had was that he saw a star and that the atmosphere distorted that star to make it look like it was moving. And yeah, this explanation kind of sounds like it was stitched together last minute, but it is what it is. And of course there were many other sightings, some which reported to see the actual object itself, which they described as a red cigar-shaped object which sailed very slowly in the sky at around the size of a DC-7 aircraft. Now, the Robertson panel, which is something I've mentioned earlier on, all of these reports that flooded the US to cause mass panic were probably perpetrated by an enemy nation such as the Soviet Union, allowing them to launch a sneak attack in all of this confusion and panic. But of course, when no invasion came, it was quite apparent that, well, maybe these sightings were real. So yeah, this is a very confusing and baffling case overall, and it makes no sense. Maybe it really was just mass panic and nobody actually saw anything concerning. The sheer number of witnesses combined with the radar sightings just makes this case that much more baffling, and I refuse to believe the explanation is as simple as temperature inversions, which doesn't even make any sense. But either way, we may never know what truly happened that day. Right then, that will be the end of my video. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe. I will be posting very similar content in the future, and yeah, just subscribe. You better.